Any bets with the U.S.?
Bets with the U.S. You know, it's funny. They haven't called. I think they're scared. I think the leadership is scared.
Have you texted with President Trump lately?
I talked to President. We are in contact, frequent contact. I look forward to seeing the president in Asia and APEC.
In a week filled with tension, the loudest sound between Ottawa and Washington wasn't an argument, it was laughter. At a public event in Ontario, Prime Minister Mark Carney smiled when asked whether he had spoken to President Trump recently. He said he hadn't heard from Washington and joked that American leaders might be scared. It was a light, almost playful remark, but it came just after the U.S. president had declared all trade negotiations with Canada officially terminated. The contrast couldn't be sharper. On one side, a furious president calling off months of trade progress over an advertisement. On the other, a calm Canadian leader talking about baseball and joking from his man cave. The laughter carried a message no press release could express. Canada wasn't panicking. It was standing its ground, even finding humor in a moment of diplomatic strain. Carney's comment quickly drew attention across Canadian and U.S. media. His light tone highlighted a deeper reality. Canada had stopped reacting with fear. This was no longer the anxious neighbor trying to patch every rift. It was a government projecting calm confidence even as talks collapsed. Trump's announcement on Truth Social had been final. All trade talks with Canada were terminated. It followed months of back and forth over tariffs and came right after Ontario's $75 million advertising campaign aired in U.S. television. While the statement aimed to project power, many wondered how such a small trigger could provoke so much anger. The stage was set for one of the most unexpected turns in North American diplomacy, a trade freeze that made Canada look calm and the U.S. appear unsettled.
Donald Trump declaring on social media that he's officially called off trade talks with Canada. It's over an advertisement from Ontario's government that's been playing on American networks.
The spark behind this diplomatic rupture wasn't a policy paper or a leaked negotiation memo. It was a television ad. Ontario's provincial government launched a $75 million campaign in October, targeting U.S. audiences. The ad borrowed the recorded voice of former President Ronald Reagan from a 1987 radio address, warning that high tariffs invite retaliation and lead to trade wars. The message was simple and familiar, a classic defense of open markets, but it carried a sting in the Trump era. It aired on major American networks right as automakers and aluminum producers were lobbying the White House for tariff relief. In Washington, the reaction was instant. The Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation accused Ontario of using the late president's words without permission and said the clip misrepresented the original speech. Within hours, Trump cooked to Truth Social, calling the ad fraudulent and announcing the end of all trade discussions with Canada. For Ottawa, this was an unexpected escalation. The campaign had been designed as a public relations move, not a diplomatic statement, but Trump's reaction gave it global visibility. Media outlets from Reuters to The Guardian covered the story within hours. Instead of silencing criticism, the White House turned a regional ad into a continental debate about free trade and political pride. Political analysts in both countries noted the irony. The advertisement that triggered the rupture wasn't directly from Carney's government, but from a provincial premier. Yet it became the pretext for Washington to freeze all negotiations with Ottawa. In that overreaction, Trump amplified the very message Ontario had tried to send, that excessive tariffs could spiral into unnecessary trade wars. What was meant as a local protest turned into an international symbol of defiance. And when Carney joked that the U.S. leadership seemed scared, it sounded less like humor and more like quiet victory. Humor in politics often hides intent. Carney's relaxed tone was not carelessness, it was calculation. For years, Trump's negotiating style relied on pressure and surprise, forcing opponents to react. This time, Ottawa didn't flinch. The Prime Minister's casual response flipped the emotional balance of power. The United States had hoped to dominate the story, to show that tariffs meant strength and Canada needed access. Yet, the headlines told a different story. Canada laughs off Trump's threat became a theme across business columns. For the first time since the early disputes of 2025, the psychological weight seemed to shift northward. Behind the scenes, talks had actually been moving forward before Trump's post. The two sides were working toward a landing zone to ease auto and steel tariffs. Instead of despair, Ottawa signaled readiness to wait. That calm posture was strategic. Economic data supported it. According to Statistics Canada's Q3 report, exports to the EU and Asia rose 9% year-on-year, easing the tariff impact. The IMF's September outlook projected Canada's GDP growth around 2% through 2026, backed by new mineral investments. These numbers gave substance to Canada's confidence. A neighbor less dependent on Washington could afford patience. And in that shift, Trump's pressure tactics began to lose effect. The threat of isolation no longer worked when the other side stopped fearing it.
By the end of the week, it was clear that the political drama had flipped. Trump's intention was to show strength. Instead, he handed Canada the spotlight. Ontario's ad, meant for a domestic audience, was now viewed millions of times online. Analysts described it as the most talked-about political advertisement in North America that month. The decision to attack it directly gave it legitimacy far beyond what the province could have achieved on its own. Carney's calm, lighthearted response deepened the contrast. Rather than meeting anger with anger, Canada met it with composure. It turned what should have been a public relations disaster into a statement of confidence. The message was clear. The era when Washington could shake Ottawa with a single post was fading. The repercussions stretched beyond Canada. Trade partners in Europe and Asia quietly observed the exchange. In Brussels and Tokyo, diplomats told reporters that Canada's reaction showed how to manage Trump's volatility, not through confrontation, but through steadiness and communication with global markets. The U.S. administration's abruptness, by comparison, was beginning to undermine its own credibility. Even some American commentators began to note the symbolism. A nation that once used humor to disarm its critics now found itself disarmed by it. The Blue Jays joke, as it came to be called, became shorthand for a broader turning point. Trump's tariff diplomacy was running out of psychological leverage. In practical terms, trade talks remain frozen. The next formal opportunity for Carney and Trump to meet will be during the upcoming Asia-Pacific and ASEAN summits. Canadian officials admit the path forward will be difficult, but the tone has already changed. Ottawa no longer sounds like the anxious partner trying to regain access. It sounds like a neighbor ready to wait, ready to rebuild confidence on its own terms. What began as a $75 million ad campaign and a passing joke has now grown into a moment of reflection for both countries. For the United States, it highlights how reactionary politics can turn strength into embarrassment. For Canada, it marks a subtle but profound shift in posture, from defensive to assertive, from cautious diplomacy to calm defiance. And as the world watches, one image lingers. A smiling Canadian Prime Minister speaking about baseball while the most powerful man in the world fumes online. In global politics, tone is often everything. This time, it wasn't tariffs or threats that defined the week, it was a smile, the kind that said Canada would no longer be scared.
With the crisis looming for hundreds of thousands of American soybean farmers, a text message to a cabinet secretary appears to show concern within the Trump administration. Now, this photo taken by the Associated Press at the UN last week is amplifying concern. It appears to show a text message to Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent from BR, widely considered to be Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins.
American soybean farmers are facing one of the hardest moments in decades. A leaked text message inside the Trump administration confirmed what many in rural America already feared: the crisis is real. For years, China was the largest buyer of U.S. soybeans, purchasing about $12.6 billion worth in 2024. In 2025, those sales have dropped to zero. Not a single cargo has left American ports for China this year. The situation became even more painful after Washington announced a $20 billion aid package for Argentina. Soon after receiving that support, Argentina removed its export tax on soybeans and quickly shipped multiple loads to China. The result was immediate. U.S. farmers lost sales that would normally go to them. Prices fell, incomes dropped, and confidence in the market collapsed. What was intended as a show of strength ended up undermining America's own producers.
President Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping, our next guest, says that a face-to-face meeting is unlikely to happen before next year.
After August 1, when the Trump administration negotiated all of these trade agreements with partners across Asia, it shows the president is still going to use various tariffs to try to generate leverage, try to reindustrialize the United States, try to drive supply chains back to the United States. So in some ways, the trade negotiations seem to never end.
The hope that diplomacy could repair the damage has faded. Despite 3 phone calls between President Trump and President Xi this year and 4 rounds of meetings between trade representatives, there is no breakthrough. Former U.S. officials and current ambassadors describe the relationship as a stalemate. Both sides repeat the same words about stability and cooling tensions, but neither is willing to compromise on the core issues. At best, the two countries may strike limited arrangements, such as a framework over TikTok or cooperation on drug precursors. These side deals do not touch agriculture. For soybean farmers waiting for markets to reopen, there is no relief in sight. The tariffs that were supposed to give leverage have instead locked both countries into a costly freeze. Every month that passes without an agreement means more pressure on American agriculture. Behind the headlines are real families. In Nebraska, Iowa, and across the Midwest, farmers are watching their balance sheets turn red. The American Soybean Association reports that with China absent, U.S. exports to that market have fallen by almost 40% compared to last year. Stocks are piling up, storage costs are increasing, and the basis at local elevators is widening. The average farm price for soybeans has slipped toward $10 per bushel for the 2025-2026 marketing year, according to projections by the Food and Agricultural Policy Research Institute. For producers who rely on thin margins, this drop is devastating. Local communities feel it too. Equipment dealers, trucking firms, and banks in rural counties are all tied to the farm economy. What began as a trade strategy in Washington is now a financial crisis in America's heartland. The irony is that while American farmers are struggling, Canada is moving in a different direction. Ottawa has been hit by Trump's tariffs on steel, lumber, and farm goods, but the response has been to accelerate diversification. Canada has expanded trade ties with the European Union, signed agreements with partners in Asia such as Indonesia, and invested in domestic industries like critical minerals and electric vehicle supply chains. This contrast is striking. In the United States, tariffs have backfired by hurting the very communities they were supposed to protect. In Canada, the same pressure has become a push to modernize and seek new markets. Farmers north of the border are not immune to global volatility, but they see opportunity where Americans now see only lost sales. The broader lesson is clear. Tariffs may sound like a shield, but when used without strategy, they can turn into a weapon against your own people. President Trump promised to defend America's farmers, yet the policies of 2025 have left them exposed. Meanwhile, Canada, once cornered by U.S. pressure, is finding ways to stand taller on the world stage. Recently, Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a forceful performance at a press conference in London. The moment came when a reporter pressed him with the criticism that he was simply flying around the world without achieving anything concrete.
Conservatives say you are jetting around but getting nothing done. You've met with numerous leaders while you've been here, but you're not signing a new deal or announcing a new partnership. What have you achieved tangibly for Canadians during this trip?
Instead of avoiding the question, Carney pointed to new trade deals, fresh partnerships, and meetings with global investment leaders.
We are focused on building a new web of trade relationships around the globe. In June, Canada signed the EU Strategic Partnership for the Future to deepen trade and mutual economic security. Last week in Mexico, I worked with President Sheinbaum to launch a new Canada-Mexico action plan to build fresh economic opportunities for our workers and businesses. Now, while in the UK, I've met with business and investment leaders to discuss new economic opportunities and partnerships as we look to attract capital to Canada.
What looked like a challenge quickly turned into a showcase of strategy. At the very moment Washington is erecting trade barriers, Canada is presenting itself as an open destination for capital and new alliances. This scene matters because Canadians at home are anxious. Jobs are being threatened by U.S. tariffs, and many families are worried about rising costs. Carney's response in London was aimed not only at the journalist in the room, but also at those Canadians who want reassurance that their government is acting with urgency and direction. Carney emphasized that Canada is not waiting for opportunity to arrive at its door. In London and New York, he met with some of the world's largest infrastructure funds, the type of global investors that finance projects from energy to digital networks. His message was simple. Canada is building a modern economy and needs hundreds of billions of dollars in investment over the next decade. Ottawa has already taken steps to back that ambition. In its first 4 months, the government cut personal income taxes for more than 22 million Canadians and reduced capital gains taxes. It removed federal barriers to interprovincial trade to create what Carney calls one Canadian economy. It passed legislation to fast-track approvals for energy, artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and trade infrastructure. And it launched Build Canada Homes to double the pace of residential construction. These policies, coupled with outreach to investors, are meant to attract capital that might otherwise hesitate in today's uncertain climate. While President Trump is pursuing tariffs that unsettle markets, Canada is telling investors that it offers stability, predictability, and the chance to grow long-term careers for Canadian workers. For investors, the signal is clear. Canada is not only lowering domestic barriers, but also promising access to growing export markets. International funds are increasingly drawn to places where governments act quickly to approve projects and provide clarity on taxation. By placing these reforms front and center, Carney is sending a message that global capital is welcome and will be safeguarded. Beyond capital flows, Ottawa is widening its trade horizons. In September, Canada signed its first bilateral trade agreement with an ASEAN country. The deal with Indonesia reduces or eliminates tariffs on 95% of Canadian exports to a nation of more than 270 million people that is projected by the International Monetary Fund to become the 5th largest economy in the world within 2 decades. Days earlier, Carney launched the Canada-Mexico Action Plan, setting a path for joint economic initiatives as both countries prepare for the scheduled review of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. In Europe, Canada signed a strategic partnership for the future in June, and negotiations are already in a second phase. The framework is linked to Europe's new SAFE initiative and the Rearm Europe plan, both of which involve hundreds of billions of euros in infrastructure and defense spending. Each of these steps moves Canada further from reliance on a single market. Trump's tariffs were designed to pressure Ottawa, yet in practice, they have accelerated Canada's turn toward Asia, Europe, and Mexico. What was meant to isolate has instead pushed Canada to diversify. The contrast is striking. In Washington, new tariffs are being announced on pharmaceuticals, furniture, and heavy trucks, creating fresh waves of uncertainty. In London, Carney is describing a Canada that is opening new doors, signing deals, and presenting itself as a partner for the future. A question that might have put him on the defensive instead became an opportunity to underline a broader message. Canada is not shrinking under pressure. It is using that very pressure to expand its reach, reduce its dependence, and strengthen its economy. For Canadians, the outcome of these moves will be measured in jobs, investment, and long-term security. For the United States, it is a reminder that trade wars often come with unintended consequences.